I'm Rick Roberts, News Talk, 820 WBAP. And most of you know, for the couple decades I've been on air, whether it was California, Texas, wherever it happened to be, I'm not real big on guests. They have to be relevant. They have to impart some information so that when they walk away, we just didn't fill some time. We hopefully were able to give you information that you didn't have before you turned the radio on. I have a man of substance with me, and I'm very, very pleased he's with me. He's been the recipient of the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, Staff Sergeant Brian Mast. He was a special ops bomb tech, worked in transportation security, also at Miami International as an explosive expert. He's also a double amputee from his service. Very, very pleased to have him with us this afternoon. And hopefully he can give some insight. First of all, Brian Mast, welcome to News Talk, 820 WBAP. How you doing?
I couldn't be better. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, you bet. You bet. This,
Actually, that's really a lie. I could be better. I was just listening to some comments from President Obama, essentially saying, about Senator Ted Cruz's comments. We shouldn't bomb ISIS because that might be used as a
recruitment tool.
In all truth, yeah, I could be better if we had a better administration.
What about the comment? Did you hear the comment? I guess he was speaking from Argentina. I guess this is the socialist communist tour he's on. But he was speaking from Argentina and said we might learn some things about human rights from Cuba. I about fell out of my chair. Carpet bombing is going to be used as a recruitment tool. You can't hug irrational people to death. It doesn't work that way. Well, you know better than anybody. Tell people a little bit about your background, so they know where you're coming from in this.
Well, my background is this: I spent about a dozen years in the U.S. Army. I was a bomb technician in what's essentially our highest level of military special operations. So I built a lot of devices and I destroyed a lot of devices. And after that, I worked with a number of federal agencies, working in counterterrorism, what you could really say. And a lot of that was in transportation security, combating the threat of explosive devices there.
And by the way, thank you for the service to the country. I mean, your resume is indeed impressive. As the founder of the Warrior Foundation in San Diego out of Balboa, I've talked with literally thousands of returning vets, most of them very young, most of them amputees. We were able to buy an apartment complex and through all volunteer materials and labor outfitted for amputees so they could kind of get adjusted with their families before they got back into civilian life. And almost to a man, when asked, how do you win a war like this? This is not a conventional war. There is no field of battle. There is no country of origin or single country of origin. And they're really, it's an ideology you're fighting. It's not, it's not about territory. It's not about anything other than the Quran and the companion book, the Hadith, and, the worldwide caliphate. I mean, what, from your perspective, you've been at the tip of the spear. From your perspective, what is this about, and is it a war that can be won?
Well, there's no question. This is a war, and what it's about is the difference ideologically between those that fall under what we call radical Islam. I tell people often, I think the word radical is used as a misnomer. Today, it would be more radical to call those who actually speak out against the acts of terror. That's much more radical. It's mainstream among Islam to simply accept these acts of terror and not speak out against them. But that's a completely different point. But no, what we have here is an ideological divide by those that essentially hate what we stand for as a people, hate the freedom, the human rights for all people, the democratic system that the United States of America represents, and also Israel in the Middle East. I mean, you can look at the parallel between the enemies that we face, whatever name of radical Islam you want to call it. Boko Haram, ISIS, Al Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever by whatever name you want to call them, we're talking about the same fighters.
Exactly, absolutely, and we have been in this war, even though we have a commander. I can't call him a commander, even though we have a president that purports to be strong militarily. I've not seen any action whatsoever that would substantiate that claim, whether it's reducing size or materials or the thing that really, I think, echoes still in my ears. He won't even call the enemy by name. How can you fight something that you can't name?
Oh, exactly. Imagine if we went back in time and General MacArthur, George Patton, anybody else that Eisenhower, they wouldn't say the word Nazi. They wouldn't call them by the term Nazi Germans. Imagine if that were something that weren't the case. It's just absolutely appalling to think that we have a commander in chief that is going around the world making victims out of people that are everything but, people in groups that are everything but, and then saying that the American people are the ones that are so often to blame for other people being victims. That's what we have here.
I am truly, truly fearful for this country and all that live within our borders. From where I'm broadcasting, just up I-35, a woman was beheaded in the workplace. Fort Hood, Texas, forever. This was workplace violence. That was almost the straw that broke the camel's back. It just goes on and on and on. But as I look at it now, what's going on in Europe is going to happen here unless something is done very differently. I'm asked all the time nationally, how do you win a war like this? In my estimation, the only way you win a war like this is to identify it, contain it, and neutralize it by any means necessary, because you certainly, nobody's clairvoyant. You can't be ahead of the loop, just like in Brussels. Would you agree with that?
That's right. You win it by fighting it. It's something that you have to have the full, all-out commitment to recognize what the threat is. So you have to assess the threat. You have to label it accurately, and then you have to put in every resource that you have in order to defeat that threat. And you're right. What we're seeing in Europe, this is something that I'm entirely fearful about seeing here in the United States on a much larger scale. And I usually paint it to people like this in comparison to our theaters of war, Iraq and Afghanistan. You think about the way that those terrorists over there have been able to wage war against our forces over there. They don't have access to Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, Radio Shack, all those places that they could just go buy materials that if I wanted to, I could go down there right now, buy every material that I could need to make as many explosive devices as what I could possibly want. They don't have access to that there. And so for those terrorists that find their way to the Western world here, they have access to every material they could possibly want. They have the training of seeing what's gone on for years on the battlefield, the kind of devices that have worked and the kind of devices that haven't worked. And they have access to probably the largest group of soft targets anywhere in the world, what is the United States of America, where you have every football game, baseball game, basketball game, play, musical, dining hall, whatever you want to call it. There's so many soft targets here in the United States, and this is a very deadly combination. And we're going to see the United States of America used as the new battlefield for radical Islam.
Talking with Brian Mast, previously in a previous life, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, Bomb Tech with Joint Operations Command, National Nuclear Administration, the Department of Homeland Security Explosive Specialist, a man of a lot of substance. We'll also take your call, Mr. President. I've been saying it for years. You should call for a moratorium on the immigration of Muslims from certain parts of the world until you figure out what's going on in your own backyard. Yes, you need to surveil mosques. You need to monitor Muslims residing in this country. I'm not saying every Muslim is a terrorist, but until somebody can come up with a way to determine a moderate Muslim from a radical Muslim, and I'm pretty sure you can't do that until after the fact, what would make sense? It would only make sense to monitor a potential. I didn't say a guaranteed threat, but a potential threat. With me, I have a very, very special guest, Bronze Star and Purple Heart recipient, Staff Sergeant Brian Mast. He has worked in lots of different areas pertaining to possible targets from terrorists. Miami International is an explosive expert. I wish I had his knowledge. Sir, thank you again for being with us. Am I wrong? I will stand corrected, but I don't know any other way. The bomb-making material that the Brussels people had, something known, if I'm not mistaken, what is it? Tracetone triperoxide, or TATP. These are made from.
You're not too far off.
It's household chemicals, right?
Yeah, you're talking about TATP, triacetone, triperoxide. I'm not going to sit here and go over the way that you can make it, except here to tell you that I could make it very simply, and anybody could find any number of video recipes on YouTube or the internet directing people how to make it. You have Al-Qaeda published magazines like Inspire magazine
Right.
that, in every issue they're telling people, hey, this is the IED of the month that we could use to bypass security or that we could use to wreak whatever kind of havoc we want. And this is what we're facing. Very unfortunate.
I got a release just before you came on air with us. As a matter of fact, it was released about 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. The Islamic State group has trained at least 400 fighters to target Europe in deadly waves to come of attacks, deploying the interlocking terror cells like the ones that struck Brussels. That from the Associated Press just a couple of hours ago. And as I said, what Europe is dealing with now, I think, and I don't mean this to be harsh, but especially France, they allowed these buildup of Muslim sectors that went without any responsibility. Police didn't go there. No one went there. And now people seem surprised that they've got an enemy within. That's exactly what could happen in the United States, is it not?
It is, and you spoke briefly about saying a moratorium. And our president, unfortunately, he speaks as though this is the most radical idea in the world, just simply putting a pause while we assess the threat. Whether we're playing football or basketball or whatever other sport, generally, sometimes you have to take a little time out here and there. You have to assess what's going on and then reassess how you're going to combat whatever it is that you're facing. And this isn't a game or some sort of sports that we're talking about here. We're talking about the life of every American across our country, because that's what radical Islam wants to do. They want to make every main street, every small town, they want to make that their new battlefield. And that's what we're fighting against. I've been a proponent of saying, as I'm a candidate for Congress also, and I tell people often when I'm asked about this, that I think what we should put in place is something that's used on American citizens like myself when we're getting security clearances. And that's polygraph testing. When I was getting my highest level security clearance, I was given a polygraph test, and they ask you very specific questions. Have you ever considered committing an act of terrorism? Would you ever consider committing an act of terrorism? And I think that would be a very simple program to put in place in order to potentially weed out some of those individuals looking to find solace here in the United States.
I couldn't agree with you more. And of course the argument is, Rick, this is a free country. Well, I don't know how you grew up, but I learned that there is no freedom without some level of responsibility. And we're fighting an enemy and a war that we've never had to fight ever in this country's history. And we are doomed to lose that unless we start thinking outside the box. As a matter of fact, I just received a notice on this: 8 targets ISIS and other terrorist groups could strike next, and this is gathered from government intelligence and major news sources. Americans traveling abroad, New York City goes into detail, London more detail, cruise ships, shopping areas, airplanes, churches, synagogues, schools. You've been in the belly of the beast and have unfortunately sacrificed greatly for it. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't think it's a big surprise to most people that have read anything about what goes on in many of these Middle East countries or that have served there in the military or with other federal agencies. But you have a people, whether you're talking about those that fall under Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they do not value life in the same way that we value life. Life is very cheap to these people, and not just life in general. When you look at the way that they treat people based off of being another religion, based off of not being a male, based off of you're saying they'll throw somebody off a building simply for living an alternative lifestyle. This is the kind of people that we're talking about. They do not value life in the same way that we do. Yet you have a commander-in-chief going out there and making it out that these people can often be the victims and instead of the aggressors. And that's what we're dealing with. And it's this poor leadership that's also allowed some of this to perpetuate itself without a question.
Before I ask you about your congressional run, and I want to, as a matter of fact, Phil, we may see if we can extend the segment a little bit. From your perspective, from your level of expertise, from your involvement over the years, what do you foresee for America, number one? And number two, is there a way for this country to protect itself in any real, meaningful way?
There absolutely is. Now, I give that with a caveat. The fact of the matter is, it was partially my job to build explosive devices as creatively as I possibly could and try to surreptitiously put those through various layers of security. And it's very difficult to defend against this. An easy example is, I'm just going to use an airport right now as an example, and we just saw this played out in Brussels. So you have a security checkpoint where you're hopefully keeping people safe on one side of it, but unfortunately on the other side of that checkpoint, you're basically herding people into a crowd. So you're herding victims into a crowd. And that's the balance of what you're doing when you're trying to combat one of these threats, where you eliminate the threat in one place, you make it a little bit greater in another place. And that's not an easy thing to do. But can we defeat this? Yes, absolutely. It begins with identifying the threat. Beyond that, it goes with identifying how we can defeat that threat and looking at what the security protocols we have in place are. And I'm going to stick with what's going on with aviation security right now, because that's where the most recent threat was. And I can tell you this is a big place that I see a hole within TSA. And it's this way, that when you think a lot of the individuals that are being hired as security experts within TSA, those that are hired as canine handlers, those that are hired as what are essentially behavioral detection officers, things like that, these are not people that have security backgrounds quite often. These are people that were there working as TSA employees that are now given the job of canine handler after a very small amount of training, or given the job of behavioral detection officer after a very small amount of training, instead of us hiring the right people for the job coming out of the military that have actually seen real terrorists face-to-face on the battlefield. That's one of the important ways that we can address this.
Very, very good point. Also, you are a congressional candidate. People can go to mastforcongress.com, and we'll make that available on the website here as well, mastforcongress.com. Tell people why. And I mean that in a very legitimate sense, not a throwaway line, but why?
No, and this is not a throwaway line. This is one of the most serious things in my life. You know, when I first thought about running for Congress, I remember the moment very specifically, and it was when I was laying in a bed in Walter Reed Army Medical Center very shortly after I lost 2 legs and a finger in Afghanistan. And I was talking to my wife, and she was holding our 6-month-old son. And I was telling her, Brianna, I don't know how I can go through life and think that the best example that I set for that little boy is now in my past, or that the best defense that I've given our country is now something that's behind me. I didn't know how to go through life and do that. And that's where I came to the conclusion that ultimately, for the best that I give our country to still be ahead of me, that I thought it would be on a new battlefield, and it would be on the battlefield of Washington, D.C., and I think it's going to be the most important fight of my life.
Brian Mast, I told you my guest was a guest of substance, and he's certainly proven that. Mastforcongress.com, M-A-S-T for Congress.com, and as I said, we'll make that available on the Rick Roberts section of the website. Sir, thank you very much for being with me, and hopefully we can talk again.
I hope so, too. Thank you.